Hey guys, it's Ellen Brock, novel editor. Today I'm going to talk about how and why to skip time in your novel. This was one of my most requested videos. I know that skipping time can be confusing or challenging, so I just wanted to go over how you might do that and why you might do that. So I'm going to go over both major jumps and minor jumps in time. Minor jumps would be maybe a few days, even a couple of hours, up to maybe 2 or 3 months. Major jumps would be 3, 4, or 5 months, up to several years. With more minor jumps in time, there are several reasons why you might want to make these jumps. Usually it's because whatever's happening during that time period is boring or irrelevant. One situation where you might want to skip what your characters are doing is when what they're doing is mundane. They're getting ready for work or school, or maybe they're just going out to eat, or they're traveling, they're in the car and they're going on a long drive, or they're going on a plane ride, and what happens during that time is not important. Or maybe even a period of time where the characters are working on a project and you just want to skip to when the project is done. Maybe they're hacking a computer and you just want to skip to a week or two later when the hacking is done because there's not a lot to describe or not a lot of interesting things happens while they're actually doing the hacking itself. When it comes to whether you should or should not skip the time, my rule is if it would be awkward or pointless to add a scene during that period of time, just skip the time. So if you could add a scene where maybe your character has a minor conflict or takes a phone call while they're getting ready in the morning, but it would really just be an attempt to create value in that scene rather than a purpose, I would just skip the time. When it comes to how you convey that jump in time to the reader, I just recommend that you go super simple, don't try to do anything fancy, and just state that the time passed. So for example, you could write something like, 2 weeks passed before Jake was able to return home, or 3 weeks later I was sitting with my friends at lunch. Those are really simple, they convey the point, it doesn't really need to get any fancier than that. If you skip time a lot, you might find it helpful to put dates or days of the week at the beginning of your chapters or scenes. In my experience, most readers don't actually read these dates, or if they do read these dates, they don't remember them. So if the passage of time is very important, I would probably still mention it in the narration. If the jump in time is relatively small, and if the jump in time isn't important, so in other words, the reader doesn't really need to know how much time passed or it's not really relevant, you don't have to explain every time there's a passage in time. You can just go ahead and skip to the next scene. In most situations, the reader really isn't going to care how much time passed, and it's probably not really going to matter, and it would be smoother to just jump into the next scene. If you're writing a novel where you need to make larger jumps in time, several months or several years, it can be helpful to establish how much time you're going to jump early in the book. So if you don't have a jump in time until 70% into the book, that can sometimes be a little bit jarring, especially if it's a big jump in time. You don't want the reader feeling like, hey, I wanted to know what happened in that period of time. What's going on? Why are we suddenly jumping way later? Especially if the character ages substantially. So the younger the character, the more likely it is to be awkward if you suddenly jump way far in time, if that happens late in the story. So if you need to jump forward in time, I would try to establish that jumping forward early on. So rather than having your character age 10 years in the middle of the novel, it might be helpful to skip a year or two early on, maybe skip 5 or 6 years sometime in the first quarter, so that if you make a big jump later on, it doesn't take the reader completely by surprise. If you do have big jumps and you need to separate your novel into sections, another approach is to create sort of a self-contained unit. So there's a story arc within each section. So say you have 2 sections, childhood and adulthood, there's a story arc in the childhood, and it feels kind of complete. So the reader is okay with moving on and transitioning into the adulthood storyline, and then that storyline is sort of complete. That can work really well. What you don't want to do is have one continuous storyline that suddenly jumps 10 years forward in time, 60, 50% into the novel. It will be rather jarring for the reader. It might make the reader kind of uncomfortable. It could even cause the reader to lose interest in the story. With bigger jumps in time, especially if it's more than a couple of years, it's usually a good idea to use parts or sections so that when the reader turns the page and they see part 2, they have time to acclimate to the idea that, okay, the story is changing now, things are going to be different, time has probably passed, and it's not quite as jarring. If skipping time isn't important to the story, it's often better to just contract the storyline. This isn't so much a problem if you have small jumps in time, a couple days, a couple weeks, but if you're frequently jumping 2 months forward or 3 months forward, but there isn't really any reason behind it, you can often get a smoother flow to the story by just making the timeline shorter. If you're not dealing with holidays or school years or big projects that need to take long periods of time or family sagas, if you're not dealing with situations where it's important that the time pass, it's often better to just make the timeline shorter, to just have the events happen closer together. It isn't a requirement, but it can make readers feel more immersed with the characters, and sometimes it can be a little bit distancing when the reader feels like they're missing out on big chunks of time. I really hope you found this video helpful, that it gave you some more confidence when it comes to jumping forward in time, and that you feel like you're more capable of making those jumps. I wasn't 100% sure what you guys wanted to know about jumping forward in time, so if this did not answer your questions, just let me know in the comments and I'll try to make a follow-up video. Happy writing, guys!